Putt-Putt closed for good on September 5th, 2016. By the time I took this, weeds were well on their way to reclaiming the property. These were the last people to run it before it joined the ranks of local entertainment landmarks that are no more. I think these days boats are stored on the property. In the few carefree, seemingly endless summer times left unspoiled by minimum wage jobs, sometimes we'd go here during the day when it was empty. At night, especially on weekends, these miniature links could get crowded and you would have to wait your turn at each hole. This hole didn't have a fence around it when we played, but someone at the insurance company must have told them to put it up. It had been the last hole of the original course, and if you aced it, they'd give you a coupon for a free game. You could win another if you got a hole-in-one that matched the colored light that came on every now and then, and they'd take your word for it. Sometimes they'd even tape a free game coupon onto the glass bottles that came out of the vending machine, which was always a wonderful surprise. I can really remember the layout of many of these holes. You really had to hit it hard to get the ball through the metal loop-de-loop and off the far wall and nearer the hole in the distant corner. There was another that was a little like skee-ball, and if you got a bullseye, the ball would spit out from behind the target and usually go in for a hole-in-one, but not always. This one was tricky because you had to carom the ball around the corner with enough strength that it stopped between these two bumps. You could waste a lot of too hard or too soft strokes trying to make it stop in there. The holes didn't always have brick boundaries like these. Cement maybe, or wood, and I remember there being a lot of orange and white. The little places for you to put your scorecard are still here. We often played for money because we gambled a lot back then. It was harder to cheat at putt-putt, unlike card games where some of the guys did cheat, and you know who you are, and shame on you. I wasn't a bad putt-putt player, but there was a kid from Richmond Street that was scary good and often scored in the low 20s. I'm pretty sure he played in tournaments when they used to have such things. Sometimes before or after the game, we'd go over to McDonald's for a burger. Back before they started counting the numbers sold in billions. When school started, we'd have lunch here, and in those days there wasn't any dining room, so we'd all have to eat outside at the retaining wall that overlooked the Orowak Lake. I remember ducks swimming over to invite feedings of bread or french fries, which even back then wasn't considered a particularly healthful thing for the ducks. There's the high school, and we'll come back for that. This area was the site of Bodeman's Boatyard. I remember a sign advertising Evinrude Motors, which went out of business in 2020. Back around 1967 or so, some friends of mine started a gang, which was called Mercenaries Incorporated, which was embroidered in gold thread on the back of a standard Levi's jean jacket. I never joined, mostly because my father wouldn't let me. Before this office building was built, there was a dry cleaners here called Dior's. One night, a group of 8 or 9 of us, most all wearing mercenary jackets, were coming home from some evening school activity when a Volkswagen with 4 very tough-looking post-high school out-of-town guys stopped us here and asked if we knew where there were any parties going on. I could tell these guys were looking for trouble, and was glad when someone said we didn't, and it began looking like they were getting ready to leave. That was until Billy, whose last name I won't reveal, even though I should, explained that we were looking for 4 guys in a Volkswagen who'd accosted someone that we knew. This comment was enough to draw the 4 battle-seeking out-of-towners out of the car, whereupon they set out to do violence to just about anybody they could get their hands on. This wasn't going to be easy, as by that time, most all of the fearsome mercenaries had already scattered, leaving me and a couple of others to fend for ourselves. One set upon me, and as I was backing away from him, I tripped over something and fell onto my back. As he rushed toward me, I felt sure that I would soon find out what getting stomped felt like. But for some reason, the driver shouted that it was time to go, and mercifully, that's what they did. That little building has been several bars and restaurants. One used to have a pretty good happy hour where I once pre-gamed for a Beach Boys concert at Jones Beach. This house was a rental for a while, and there was a guy somebody knew who lived there and was learning to become a tattoo artist. He was willing to give free ones to anybody who wanted them. I went there with a couple of friends, and I remember sitting in the kitchen as he boiled the tattoo needles in a pot of water. The two guys I was with got their names drawn on them freestyle, and in both cases, it turned out to be a terrible mistake. I didn't get a tattoo that night. In fact, I never did, even though I kind of always wanted to. Of course, the post office, and back behind there was a little building that was a head shop for about 5 minutes back in the late 60s. For a long time, this place was a dress or bridal shop, and this was a laundromat before they started selling yogurt. This in here was a row of professional offices, and in one was the highly thought of and well-liked dentist, Dr. Jerry Hoffman. I think everybody's going to remember the old high school. If you're a member of the class of 1970, you attended 7th grade here and probably had your homeroom in the auditorium with a bunch of other homerooms. My memory is that the whole school was here for the first part of the year, but later the new high school opened and things became less crowded. I think this was once known as the campus shop, but I remember it only as an appliance store. This store was always a pharmacy, and I used to go in to get candy after school. This is the hardware store that I knew as Ellis's, and it was the place to go for hardware in the days before Home Depot. It had hardwood floors, and somebody would usually come to help you find what you needed. When we were selling my parents' house not too long ago, I came here to get a little chain for turning a light on and off. And sure enough, the clerk found one inside a little manila envelope, tucked away in a drawer somewhere. This place was once Terry Jewelers, which I never entered. Upstairs there was a dentist that my family went to a couple of times, but after a while we stopped going there. This was Epstein's, which had the school gym outfits franchise, and our football coaches used to send us down there to buy jocks. I remember it as very old school, with clothes piled up on countertops, and you'd almost always have to ask somebody to help you find something. Later, it was converted to Charlie's Used Furniture, best known for the old-time buggy that he kept on its roof. Next door was once a guns and ammo store, and later it was converted to a plumbing supply. No doubt here's Maxwell's, which was once Hutley's. Before that it was Hockheiser's 5 and Dime. I spent a lot of time in Hutley's and have many fond memories of good times there. Next door is Ritz's Deli, where I would order bologna on rye with mustard and nothing else. This is Andy's Pizza. When he first opened, the kitchen was behind a wall that he built, and you ordered your pizza through a little window, which at the time I thought was pretty unusual. Originally there wasn't much, if any, seating, but later they expanded to include at least this second storefront. Changes have been made to the facades, but I think in here was Rose's stationery store. I once went there to buy airplane glue, and the cigar-smoking proprietor cracked, "The kind you sniff?" It was, but even then I knew that sniffing glue was whack. I think Louie's Candy Kitchen was in here, and for a while it was a popular hangout that had booths down one side and a counter with round swivel seats on the other. Further along here was a tailor and Bill's barber shop. Here was Joseph Moore's insurance agency. In these two stores was Aliata's travel agency, which was where I bought my very first airplane ticket. I remember the travel agent searching for flights in what looked like a thick phone book. She booked me on a Northwest Orient Airlines flight to Minneapolis. This was once an A&P, and after it closed, it became political headquarters for LBJ's presidential campaign. My father was greatly involved in that run, and I well remember spending quite a bit of time in there with him, hand-addressing envelopes, giving out literature and buttons, and going out to put up posters on telephone poles. And it was particularly fun and allowed to tear down Goldwater's. A shoe repair shop was in here when every town had at least one or two of them. They're mostly gone now. Along in here was a typewriter repair shop, a bakery, a meat market, and some other stores whose exact locations I'm unsure of. At the very end was an auto parts store, whose main competition was probably the Mars store in Bayshore. In here was the town annex, and this little building once housed the First National Bank. A little further on was a Rexall drugstore. One of these stores was once a luncheonette called Vinnie's, and it was a pretty busy hangout for a while. I can remember nursing a Coke in there for hours, and in those days everybody was smoking. This place was called the Garden House, which was a tip of the hat to the Ulysses, classical Latin alphabet, which is something I only recently learned of. The bank moved into this grand building, and I remember it being very quiet and serious inside. It's now a very good steakhouse, and the area where loans were arranged has been converted into a very elegant barroom. There's the Islip War Memorial, which for a summer, maybe two, was a big hangout for people who identified as hippies. This is Islip's Town Hall, which was completed in the early 30s. In 1969, the east and west wings were added. This is the Okanee Diner, which opened in 1967. I can remember quite a few visits here after a night's carousing. Behind these hedges was a mansion that I remember us kids sneaking into and exploring before it was to be demolished. I recall a rumor that there was a stocked wine cellar, but if there was, it had already been cleared out by the time we got there. So now here on St. Mark's Lane, we're going to turn around. Here's St. Mark's Church, which had a fire years ago, but the big news was that they would rebuild it to look just like the original, and that's what they did. This was the Castle Inn where I worked when I was maybe 15 or 16, washing dishes, setting up and moving tables and chairs, and vacuuming the red carpet in the beautiful lobby with the wonderful stone fireplace and fancy woodwork. I think I got $1.25 an hour, and I would classify it as my first truly horrible job, of which there would be plenty more. This place used to be Marion's small motor repair and bicycle shop. My brother Phil once bought an outboard motor from him, but it didn't work, so he had to bring it back, even though Marion said it was a one-shot deal. I think my father had to get involved. This is where the Town Hall Diner stood, where we used to go after bar time and drink beer. A friend of mine often ran out on his bill, but still managed to get served again by promising the kind-hearted counterman Joe that he was sorry and wouldn't do it again, and then hilariously, he'd do it again. This is South Bay Avenue, not Beach Road, though it does lead to Islip Beach. We used to hitchhike down this road, and sometimes we'd have to walk all the way. For a while, there was a bank drive-thru on this lot that got pretty busy on Fridays. This was Dr. Guggenheim's house and office, back in the days when doctors worked out of their houses, like on the Donna Reed show. This was a Masonic temple, and though I've watched lots of documentaries about these guys, I've never been inside this or any other one. This one's getting converted to condos. In here, there was a Bohack's grocery store, and then another called Associated. With the A&P right across the street, seems to me that there were too many grocery stores for any one of them to succeed, and they didn't. Associated sold a few clothing items, and if you wanted to insult somebody's garb, you'd ask, "Where did you get those shoes?" Associated? It was mean, but funny. This started out as Allen's Pharmacy before becoming Verizer's Pharmacy. In the late 60s, it was converted by future town supervisor Pete McGowan to a bar called The Pump House. I haunted this place for a while. I loved their grilled boar's head hot dogs, which were served with Cheez-Its. Right next door was Mulcahy's, which had earlier been Penny Sue's Luncheonette. After Mulcahy's, it was converted to a restaurant called the Bayberry Cafe, where Chef Kevin McCarthy cooked me as good a piece of swordfish as I've ever eaten. A little further down was Chicken Delight, which was there for many years. They served their to-go chicken meals between two pulpy paper plates that were stapled together. When they were cooking, you could smell that chicken a block away. The Cleaners has been there for as long as I can remember. A pretty good 5 and 10 used to be on this corner, and it won't be long now before nobody knows what a 5 and 10 cent store was. A little further down was the Town Tavern. We used to sneak in before turning 18, which, believe it or not, was the legal drinking age back then. It was a quintessential bar room with a couple of pinball machines and a pool table in the middle. There was a barber shop along here, and the guy who owned the place put a bumper pool table in the back room and invited us guys to use it whenever we wanted. I don't remember ever taking him up on that offer. In here was a health food store that I remember seeing window signs advertising a product called Tiger's Milk, whatever that is. There weren't that many health food stores around back then. For a long time, this was Phelan's liquor store, and only recently was changed to something else. This was J&M Music, where I took guitar lessons from a guy who knew saxophone a lot better than he did guitar. But I guess anybody with any musical training could get you through the first one or two Alfred Method guitar books. I bought an electric guitar at J&M, and its primary allure to me was that it had 3 pickups. Its ill-designed neck rendered it practically unplayable. This real estate store was once a deli, which again put 2 such stores within yards of each other. This place was said to have been the site of a holdup where I believe the counterman was killed. I don't remember this place ever being anything other than a cleaner's. And again, just yards down the street from a store providing the exact same service. Before becoming a cleaner's, it was a Flying A, then Sinclair gas station. I'm not sure what was in here, but back behind this fence there were once law offices. The Islip Theater has been going in and out of business for a while. My mother used to love movies, especially musicals, and I went to see some with her. The Flower Drum Song comes to mind. She would always stop first to get candy to avoid the theater's high prices. During that crazy, overcrowded year just before they opened the new high school, they held classes in this building, which they called the Annex. I didn't take any there, and for some reason, I've always felt a little deprived. These 2 white picturesque churches have been on Islip's main street for a long time. The first is Methodist, and the second Presbyterian. I'm pretty sure that Mr. Biancardi lived down one of these streets, as my brother told me that when he was out on a run, he'd stop by his house and chat with him. Mr. B was a wonderful and unforgettable character. This was the Buys Brothers Printing Company, and they were a pretty good-sized printer back then, full service enough to print books. As someone who was interested in printing, when I was young, I once thought I'd work there, but I never did. I'm not sure what was in here, but this is Ocean Avenue, along which there were some pretty nice houses. South of the road on which I've been driving, which is Montauk Highway, was considered then the better part of town. The toniest section south of Montauk was, and I imagine still is, Bayberry Point, which is adjacent to the Great South Bay. There was once a gas station here, and my only memory of it was walking home from summer football practice with Billy Bruni and stopping here. Billy bought himself and me multiple returnable glass bottles of soda from a vending machine. I don't remember them costing any more than 10 or 15 cents, but because it was hot and the soda was so cold, I remember how good they tasted. Billy was thought to be well off because his father owned a Chevy dealership. This was Exie Mayer's auto repair shop. My father ran against Exie for the school board and was quite soundly defeated. One of these buildings housed Hard Sales, which was a leading innovator of sail design beginning in the 1950s. They made sails for more than 100 national and international small boat racing champions, and was one of the first to use computers to design sails. I think these were always service stations of one kind or another, but that building there, that's the Viking Inn. It was noted for hosting competitive dart tournaments, as well as getting some pretty good bands in there to perform. It's where the Tuneful Trolley had their 50th anniversary. Right across the street is Overton's Funeral Parlor. And I'm not saying that everybody who's ever lived in Islip eventually passes through those doors, but almost everybody does. After wakes, mourners often walk over to the Viking to toast the dearly departed. There used to be an old-school Carvel stand on this property, and in here is a trailer park that's been here an awfully long time. This is the old Seascape Inn that back in the 60s and 70s was the place to go for good food. Over the years, it changed hands a few times, and now it's operated by a small chain called JR's Steak. Down the street, Hank Kavanaugh and I kept our clam boat for one summer. Our little business on the bay didn't fare well and ended when our boat was sunk by whoever it was that owned the dock that we were tying up to without bothering to pay them for the privilege. And now we're back at McDonald's. And I wasn't going to admit this, but one night a heist, and that's what it was called, was planned here in which one of us, and it wasn't me because I was too big a chicken, went into the burger stand and ordered 15 or 20 cheeseburgers. The car we were in was parked directly across the street, just to my left, and I can remember watching our point man sprinting from the store and across the street and leaping into the car as all mayhem broke out. Everyone was laughing their heads off as the driver peeled out and the burgers were passed around. It is probably thanks to us that forever thereafter, at least at that particular McDonald's, they would first get their money before handing over the food. Okay, so now we're back at the school, and in 1970, only this administration building existed. And this was where we played soccer, and for a brief while, I remember Mr. Metis rolling out this enormous canvas ball, and us guys played a game called push ball, where all of us crowded around it and tried to push the ball downfield to our opponent's goal. I remember this game as being great fun, but for some reason it didn't last very long. Maybe that big ball got punctured or something. And here, well, this is the place that all of us from the class of 1970 have in common, and where a great many very important things happened to us. Some were wonderful, and others terrible. And for better or worse, most of us remember both, and everything in between. This was a nice design touch. Downstairs was the office, and upstairs the library, where I used to go and thumb through magazines. Down here is the auditorium, and a pretty decent-sized lobby. And there's the cafeteria, once described by a not-so-cosmopolitan classmate as akin to the Waldorf Historia. Back here is student parking. Hidden behind these bushes is the north segment of Itasca Lake, and a little further up is a land bridge that divides the lake. For an all too brief period, it was a great place to meet friends before school. Mr. Marsh barged in on this fun, and the place was soon declared off limits. The principal in 2018 was a guy named Michael Mosca, and he gave me a nice tour. He showed me a wall that was dedicated to all Islip veterans. I was reminded of Bernardino Genci, who is honored on this wall. Tragically, he was killed in Vietnam at just 23 years old. The year we graduated, somebody started an award in his honor. Because he was a gifted industrial arts student, it was to be given each year to a graduate who was planning to continue study in that field. In 1970, that student was me. I was told that a plaque would be put up in the school and be annually updated with that year's winner. For reasons unknown, neither of these things ever happened. Everybody remembers this place. I was really impressed by how good it still looks. And unlike a lot of things that shrink over time, the gym still looked to be about the same size as I remember it. I can recall the charge of excitement here during Friday night basketball games. Out here was where the varsity club sold New York cart-style pretzels from laundry baskets, and the pretzels were often still moist so that the kosher salt would stick to them. The club would also sell you a waxed paper cup of Pepsi for 10 or 15 cents. Here's the office where sometimes you'd get called down to if you skipped class or did something else that you weren't supposed to. These doors here are new, perhaps added for security or maybe just to save energy. I remember Mr. Verizon standing in this area in the morning, monitoring things and keeping things moving. This on the left was the school store, and I think it was run by DECA, which was a business club, and this guy named Bill DePace really took ownership of it and rechristened it DePace's Corner. Here is Islip High School's Hall of Fame, where class of 70 member Alan Mayer is honored for his accomplishments in athletics, particularly soccer. Dave Rivola is also honored for his heroism as a rescue helicopter pilot, and Tommy Verizon, who spent 10 years playing Major League Baseball. The classroom on the right was my homeroom back in the 9th or 10th grade and was overseen by Mr. Abrams, who, as it turns out, was probably one of the kindest, caring, and most talented teachers I ever had in Islip. It was in that room that I watched Mr. Abrams come under attack by a group of high school students who knew Mr. Abrams primarily through after-school detention, which he also oversaw. My memory is that this group, some of whom I knew but not well, were hanging around outside the classroom and wouldn't leave when he told them to. It started as some pushing, but escalated to where Mr. Abrams was in the clutch of 2 or 3 of them as another slammed a metal wastepaper basket against his back. It was a terrible thing to see, and I always felt bad for feeling and being so helpless. I think I took typing in here, which I still consider one of the most useful skills I acquired in Islip. Here's that lobby and the auditorium that was redone because of some extensive water damage done a year or 2 before. I remember taking this walk to get to lunch, and of course, here's that walled-off Historia-looking lunchroom again, where most of the dances were held. It's funny how such a place could be transformed into such a beguiling and romantic room by just the dimming of lights and the clearing of an area for dancing. Down here were the industrial art labs, which we used to just call shops. This was for metal, where the teacher made molds from packed sand and poured molten metal into them that produced little castings for us to take home. I made a tear-shaped ashtray for my dad and a cookie sheet for my mother. Over here was where the wood shop used to be, and it looks to have been repurposed for music storage. In the back corner was where I learned about graphic arts. The room has been converted into a television studio, green screen and all. On the right was where art classes were conducted. Up ahead, that new doorway leads to yet another expansion. In the 10th or 11th grade, they moved the graphic arts classes into this room, which the prior year I had taken an English class with Mr. Ock, who I thought was a good teacher and a nice guy. This move provided the graphic arts students with a great deal more room. Mr. Moscow told me that it's now used to teach architecture. They teach architecture in high school? George Costanza would have been right at home. Back here was where the new darkroom was, which was a little better than the old one, but not much. In 1976, author Ralph Keyes wrote a book entitled, Is There Life After High School? And of course there is. Some say that life after high school is just more of the same. Tom Brokaw observed that everyone's still trying to get to the right tables, hang out with the right crowd, say the right things, and be part of the in crowd. Tom Hanks agreed, saying that all of America is essentially frozen in high school. Maybe, maybe not. But there is no question that somehow memories of the time spent in halls like these are much more deeply ingrained and probably do have an outsized influence on the adults that we eventually become.